The official preliminary report is out on the Air India 787 crash that occurred in India on 12 June, ending weeks of senseless misinformation, speculation, and AI slop. We're going to go over the timeline of the handling of the fuel control switches that led to this disaster. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the BLANCOLIRIO channel. Let's get into it. It's Friday, the 11th of June, and this video, like all the others, is brought to you by viewers like you that sponsor this channel here on Patreon. Thank you for your support. First, let's start with the location of the critical cockpit components as they were found at the wreckage site. First, we can see that the APU inlet door was open. In other words, the APU had initiated its start sequence. Second, we see the flap handle lever in the flaps 5 position, and that's corroborated by the wing flaps and the damaged wings being found in the flaps 5 position. This is looking aft, so there's the first notch for the second notch for the flaps 5 condition of the flap lever handle. The gear lever is found in the down condition. They never did get the gear retraction sequence started. The fuel control switches are found in the up or run condition. The thrust levers are found in the idle condition. However, the data indicated that the thrust levers were forward of the entire time until the data ended. So in other words, these thrust levers were brought back to idle by impact. There were 2 pilots on board the aircraft, the 56-year-old captain and a 32-year-old first officer. The captain with 15,638 hours and the first officer with 3,403 hours. Time and type, 8,596 for the captain and 1,128 for the first officer. There is no indication on this report of a third pilot or any other crew member being in the cockpit at the time of this accident. Both data recorders were recovered, downloaded, and interpreted there in Delhi. Boeing, GE, and the NTSB were a party to the investigation and the interpreting of the data. On the 787, both the data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder are both in the same box, and there's 2 of these boxes, one located in the forward end of the aircraft and one located in the aft end of the aircraft. Both were recovered and had good data. The flight was scheduled to depart for Gatwick at 0740 Zulu time. The co-pilot, this is critical, the co-pilot was the pilot flying and the PIC was the pilot monitoring for this flight. Remember, crew members normally take turns on each leg. One pilot flying, one pilot monitoring, and those roles reverse. There were 230 passengers on board, 54,200 kilograms of fuel on board, and the aircraft was loaded fairly close to its max gross weight, but was not overloaded. The V-speeds were calculated to V1 of 153 knots, rotate 155 knots, and V2 of 162 knots. The outside air temperature at the time of departure was between 36 and 37 degrees Celsius. That's 96.8 degrees Fahrenheit, and the winds 240 at just 6 knots. The aircraft started up and taxied out uneventfully and started its takeoff roll at 080737 UTC, or what I call Zulu time, and the aircraft crossed takeoff decision speed V1 of 153 knots at 080833, so a normal acceleration. 4 seconds after the aircraft rotated, the weight on wheels switches transitioned the aircraft from ground mode to air mode. The aircraft achieved a maximum speed of 180 knots at 080842. Just 3 seconds after the weight on wheel switches transitioned from ground mode to air mode. So far, everything operating normally. Immediately thereafter, engine number 1 and engine number 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff, one after the other, with a time gap of just 1 second. And the engine N1 and N2 began to decrease from their takeoff values as the fuel supply to the engines were cut off. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, "Why did he cut off?" The other pilot responded that he did not do so. All right, let's take a break from the timeline here and discuss more clearly exactly how this procedure is done in the cockpit. Let's transition over to this picture from John Ostrauer of the Air Current, who got this article out ahead of everybody else. This is the 787 throttle quadrant, if you will. Here's the thrust levers right here, left and right. Here's the reversers up over here. Here's the TOGA, or takeoff or go around switches right here. Here's the auto throttle disconnect button here. But here's the two left and right fuel control switches. Let me blow this up a little bit so you can see better. These two big switches have a metal guard right here. So in order to actuate these switches from the run to the cutoff position, you have to physically pull the switch out, drop it over the metal guard here, and then drop it down into the off position. So it takes a very deliberate action to prevent somebody from accidentally hitting these switches into the off position. Now, at the risk of a copyright strike from Just Planes, I want to share with you a clip of Just Planes video of the 787 departure and show you how this works, how this choreography works, especially when the first officer is the pilot flying and the captain is the pilot monitoring. With the first officer flying, she initiates the throttles up to the takeoff position and then transitions the throttles or thrust levers, whatever your particular language is to this day, over to the captain, because it is the captain's decision to make the reject call in the event that they need to reject the takeoff. It's the captain's call, the decision to make the reject. So the throttles are handed over to the captain, thrust levers, and the FO typically grabs the yoke with both hands and initiates the takeoff. Crew members call out the speeds. And it takes a good long time to get up to rotate speed. Okay, she's going to rotate. She's going to use both hands to rotate. The captain, in this case, takes her hands off of the throttle. Normally, at that point, if I'm flying in the right seat, I'm going to transition my left hand over to the thrust levers and take command of those thrust levers. So during the initial part of the takeoff roll, the captain has his hands on the throttles if the first officer is flying. In other words, there's not an extra set of hands to mess around with the fuel cutoff switches until you reach V1 rotate, and the captain takes his hands off the thrust levers, and the FO should either have both hands on the yoke or get this left hand over there on the thrust levers where they should be. Now, once they're underway and they've got positive rate, the first officer can call for the gear up and the captain can reach over and raise the gear. Let's check out this crew video from Ben Hewitt on a Virgin Atlantic 787-900. Again, first officer is flying, both hands on the yoke. He's nailing the center line nicely. Hear the bump, bump, bump. Get that thing off of those lights. V1, rotate. You see the captain's hands come off the thrust levers. Positive rate, gear up. The reason you can take your hands off the thrust levers at this point is the throttles are in a throttle hold position. The Auto throttle servos are just holding the thrust levers in a set position. Okay, so in the report here it says the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other why he did cut off, and the other pilot responded that he did not do so. It does not distinguish which pilot is which, and we will need to find that out in subsequent reports. Now, in this Air India accident report, it brings up this old airworthiness directive about the fuel control switches locking mechanism not quite working correctly, and they reference the 737 aircraft as the fuel cutoff switches are basically the same design. And as per information from Air India, the suggested inspections to make sure that these locking switches work correctly and you cannot easily bump them into the cutoff position, the suggested inspections were not carried out as the SAIB was advisory and not mandatory. This information airworthiness bulletin. So what they're saying is there's the possibility that if somebody's guarding the throttles and you're bouncing around, you could accidentally hit those cutoff switches, and if the guard is not working correctly, you could accidentally knock those switches to cutoff. In other words, if somebody was guarding the throttles with their hand behind the throttles while the other pilot was pushing the throttles up, or thrust levers, that hand guarding the thrust levers or throttles could potentially hit those fuel control switches to the cutoff position. Note also these two bars here. They're just fixed there. So that's another design attempt to prevent the accidental, inadvertent cutting off of those switches by hitting them with something. The rest of the timeline goes very quickly. From rotate at 080835 to the data stopping is just 36 seconds. Shortly after the fuel was cut off, the RAT, or ram air turbine, was deployed as designed. At 180 knots, the aircraft had enough smash to begin a climb, but the aircraft started to lose altitude before crossing the airport perimeter wall. And there's a picture showing the RAT, or ram air turbine, deployed. As the N2 values dropped below minimum idle speed, the RAT began supplying hydraulic power at 080847. At 080852, the flight data recorder records the number one engine fuel cutoff switch transitioning from cutoff back to run. So 10 seconds after the switches were knocked to the cutoff position, they were put back to the run position. The APU inlet door began opening at 080854, consistent with the APU start logic. Thereafter, at 080856, the number 2 fuel cutoff switch also transitions from cutoff to run. So somebody's making an attempt to get the engines going again. When the fuel control switches are moved from cutoff to run while the aircraft's in flight, each aircraft's FADEC automatically tries to restart the engines. The problem is there's simply not enough time to get the engines relit and spooled back up before impact. The EGT was observed to be rising for both engines, indicating a relight. Engine number 1's core deceleration stopped, reversed, and started to progress towards a recovery. So the number 1 engine was relighting. The number 2 engine was able to relight but could not arrest the core speed deceleration and reintroduced fuel repeatedly. This is done automatically through the FADEC to increase core speed acceleration and attempt to recover. At about 080905, one of the pilots transmitted Mayday, 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 and at 080911, just a few seconds later, the data ended. Fuel samples have been tested, and at this stage of the investigation, there are no recommended actions for the 787 or the GE engines. So of particular interest to me at this point is the condition of these fuel cutoff switches, particularly the locking mechanism. It's going to be hard to tell from their current state as to the condition of the locking mechanism. Were these fuel cutoff switches intentionally cut off or accidentally cut off by somebody guarding the throttles and bumping around in the turbulence and of the aircraft bouncing down the runway on takeoff? We may never know the answer to this, but at least we now know what happened to the 787 in Air India, ending weeks of senseless speculation and AI slop here on the internet. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this channel possible. See you here.